Welcome everyone! Today you'll get to see both the biggest opening surprise by Fischer in his World Championship match and a strategic masterpiece as well. It also has to be one of the best games of the match, maybe even the best game full stop. This is game 6 of his 1972 match against Spassky. Fischer had white, and remember how Fischer always said e4 best by test? Well, 1c4 was his opening move. And this must have been a huge surprise to Spassky. Fischer had never opened with this move before, and certainly most of Spassky's preparation was dedicated to e4. Well, let's see what happened. e6, knight f3, d5, and after d4 we have transposed to the Queen's Gambit declined, which for Fischer really wasn't a surprise. That was Spassky's main weapon. It continued knight to f6, knight c3, bishop e7, and after bishop to g5 we also get to see Spassky's pet line against the Queen's Gambit. First, castles e3 and h6, and after bishop to h4 black could play the Lasker variation with knight to e4, but Spassky's favorite was the Tartakower variation with b6, and here's a cool statistic. Even though Spassky used this defense many times before, he only ever lost one game with it prior to this game. So Fischer got his opening move in, but he still had the difficult task of breaking Spassky's Tartakower, and here he selected a less common continuation. He traded on d5, rook to c1, bishop d3 and bishop to e2 are all more common. Of course, white has a solid game, but after knight takes, black will be able to trade pieces, and black's really happy to do that, since after bishop takes, the queen gets to e7, which is a good square for the queen anyway, but also the rook on f8 can get to the central files more quickly now. But of course, Fischer specifically picked this variation, so he had something in mind. First, they traded knights as well, and then rook to c1. Sooner or later black will play c7, c5, and then the rook will already be well placed. Then bishop to e6. The bishop wouldn't really be good anymore on b7, it would only be staring at the d-pawn. But equally important, once the b-file opens up after black breaks out with c5, a rook on b8 can put pressure on the b-file. Then queen to a4, and you may think what's the queen doing? The point is that after c5, queen a3 pins the pawn. The c-pawn is also hanging now, so rook to c8, and here a crafty move by Fischer, bishop to b5, which looks slightly odd since the bishop isn't targeting anything and black can simply threaten the bishop with a6, but that is actually the point. After a6, the b6 pawn is weakened and therefore the entire pawn chain. This wasn't a new move however, and it seems that queen to b7 is a good response. Now the c-pawn isn't pinned anymore and the queen guards the rook, so a6 is actually a threat now. However, Spassky didn't play that, he did go for a6 anyway, but you can see that in this position the bishop isn't really hanging because the rook on a8 is undefended. Fischer therefore ignored this and traded on c5, giving black the so-called hanging pawns, which can be a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, they can be very strong because they take away a lot of squares. On the other hand, if they turn out to be weaknesses, then black can get in serious trouble. Fischer castled, and Spassky decided to unpin the pawn with rook to a7. Again, queen to b7 was probably better because this also solves the pin of the c-pawn, but rook to a7 was Spassky's choice. The bishop's hanging, so it retreated. Knight to d7, and here knight to d4. After knight d7 the pawn was once again pinned. Queen f8 defended the queen, but here's an instructive move by Fischer. He took the bishop on e6. White wants to trade pieces because even though black's pawns can be weak, they do cramp white's pieces, and so white benefits from trading. It'll also be easier for white to attack the pawns now, and you'll also notice after pawn takes knight, that white is now playing with a bishop against a knight, and when the position opens up that can be very difficult for black. And therefore Fischer strikes with e4 right away, hoping to open up the position, and unfortunately for Spassky, he doesn't have a really pleasant way to deal with this. If pawn takes e4, then black gets these horrendous split pawns. I can imagine Spassky didn't even consider going for this. If instead c4, also hoping to trade queens, then queen to h3 is unpleasant. And if the queen defends, then white can first flick in bishop to h5. And after black also weakens the pawn cover of the king, then go bishop g4, and now two pawns are hanging. Maybe black's best would be knight to f6, actually tempting the pawn forward. But even then, after f4, black's kingside will be under pressure after the queen moves in, probably followed by one of the rooks as well. However, even that would be better than what happened in the game. If we go back, here Spassky decided on d4, and he was heavily criticized for this move. Of course, we can understand why he didn't like the alternatives, but now the pawns cannot really advance anymore, and white's bishop gets a great view from the c4 square. But first Fischer went f4. Fischer now wants to play bishop to c4, attacking and pinning the e-pawn, and then attack it again with f5. But he first follows up with another great move. After queen e7, he went e5, fixing the weak pawn. It also prevents black from playing e5 himself, and it also makes black's d-pawn more vulnerable. If white would ever go b2, b4 and trade black's c-pawn, then the d-pawn will be a sitting duck, since black cannot defend it with the e-pawn anymore. Anyway, Spassky continued with rook to b8, but this is inaccurate. He really had to play knight to b6 to stop white from going bishop to c4. After rook to b8, Fischer didn't hesitate to get his bishop on that great square, threatening with f5. And if Spassky goes knight to b6 now, then the best move is actually queen to b3, but it's more flashy to play queen takes pawn, because if black takes, then the discovered attack wins the queen back, and white has a winning position. That didn't happen, Spassky just tucked the king in the corner, but now, besides attacking the weak e-pawn, Fischer now also has his eyes on the black king. Queen h3 was his next move. He doesn't need to guard the b-pawn. If black would take, then after bishop takes e6 and simply bringing the bishop back, white has very strong mobile pawns while blacks are still blockaded. Strategically, white would be winning here. Therefore, knight f8 instead, guarding e6, b3, keeping everything protected, a5, hoping that one day black can undermine those pawns, but really Fischer can just ignore that. It's time to go for black's throat. f5, black cannot allow pawn to f6, so e takes f5, then knight to h7, hoping to at least get the knight to g5. It also stops rook to f7, because the knight would fork queen and rook. Fischer instead brought the second rook over, and after queen to d8, queen to g3, now he'd like to advance the e-pawn and use the e5 square. Spassky really can do nothing at this point. He went rook to e7, but then h4, simply taking away g5 from the knight. It's only getting worse. Rook from b to b7 was played, but then e6, rook from b to c7, queen to e5. Fischer's improving his army while black's is unable to do anything meaningful. Queen e8 was played, and now Fischer even went a4. He really didn't need to play that. He's just demonstrating how little black can do. He's simply giving the move back to Spassky, who simply brought the queen back. Rook from 1 to f2, queen e8, then rook from 2 to f3. Kind of waiting moves actually by Fischer, probably simply to get to the time control more quickly. The queen went back again, but after bishop to d3, it's time to get active again. White plants a battery with queen to e4, and then it's really looking bad for the black king. Queen e8 once again, queen e4, now white's threatening with a rook check on f8, and 2 moves later mate on h7. It's just game over now. Spassky still played knight to f6, but Fischer can now rely on brute force. Rook takes knight, pawn takes, and rook takes f6. There's simply no defense. King to g8 was still played, but bishop to c4 tempted the king back in the corner. But after queen to f4, threatening with rook f8 and a quick mate after queen takes h6, Spassky threw in the towel and resigned. Just a wonderful game by Fischer. He made it look like he played this type of position all the time, even though he never played the Queen's Gambit in any official game. Let's briefly check a couple of key positions. At this point, Spassky started making it hard on himself by going for a6 instead of queen to b7. Fischer then left Spassky with these hanging pawns, which can be good, but with d4, Spassky did make a positional mistake, giving Fischer easy pressure on his pawns, but also making sure his c and d pawns are immobile and basically useless now. It didn't take long before they then reached this position, and Fischer could almost play this on autopilot and then wrap up this great technical game. Very nicely done. Please let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think this is the best game of the match? If you at least like this game, please consider simply liking the video and subscribing to the channel. There will be another great game tomorrow, so I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.